The airlock let out a dramatic hiss, like an overexcited kettle, as it slid open, revealing the shiny, futuristic interior of Orbital Medical Station Zeta. Greg stepped through, his boots sticking to the metal floor with a satisfying clunk as the magnets kicked in. He wrinkled his nose at the familiar sterile scent of recycled air. His new home sweet home for the next, well, however long space contracts lasted these days. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Greg," a smooth, almost too perfect voice chimed. Greg spun around, and his brain immediately short-circuited. Standing before him was the most stunning person he had ever seen, and that was saying something considering he once went on a date with someone who claimed to be half-mermaid. This woman, though, wow. Her skin was an almost neon shade of blue that seemed to glow under the station's lights. And her medical uniform? Well, let's just say it fit her as well as a space glove fits a human hand. But it was her eyes that really got him. Two mesmerizing orbs of violet that sparkled like someone had added glitter to her DNA for extra flair. "Hi, I'm Xena, Chief Medical Officer," she said, extending a delicate blue hand, as if she hadn't just knocked him into another dimension. "Hope you're up for some cosmic escapades, Dr. Greg." Greg, realizing he had been staring longer than was socially acceptable in any galaxy, scrambled to shake her hand, all the while mentally kicking himself. "Yeah, cosmic escapades, sure, I love those," he said, trying to sound like a cool, seasoned space adventurer and not someone who still got lost in IKEA. This was going to be an interesting mission, to say the least. Xena's violet eyes sparkled with amusement as she clasped Greg's hand. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck, and for a moment, he was sure he was turning as red as Mars. She tilted her head, still holding his hand a bit too long. Was this how handshakes worked in space? Or had he missed a memo? "Well, Dr. Greg, I hope you're ready," Xena said with a grin that suggested she enjoyed watching newbies squirm. "Things get weird around here. We've got patients from all corners of the galaxy. Last week, we treated a guy whose species sheds its skin every 12 hours like a space lizard. I barely had time to update his chart before he left an entire pile of himself on the med bay floor." Greg gulped. That, sounds manageable." Xena finally let go of his hand, giving him a playful shove towards the corridor. "Oh, don't worry, you'll get used to it. Plus, I'll be around to make sure you don't accidentally prescribe someone a cure for the common cold that also makes them grow a second head. Unless you want to cause an intergalactic incident." Greg chuckled nervously, trying to play along, but inside, he was mentally preparing himself for space medical school all over again. Second heads? Shedding skin? What else could go wrong? As they strolled through the hallway, Greg's mind raced with all sorts of ridiculous possibilities. Maybe they'd have to treat a patient whose organs were on the outside of their body. Or, better yet, someone who communicated only through interpretive dance. He could already picture himself flailing around in front of a patient like a confused space mime, while Xena stood in the background, laughing her blue head off. They arrived at the med bay, and Greg couldn't help but admire how sleek and high-tech everything looked. There were holographic displays showing patient vitals, machines that probably performed surgeries with laser precision, and an assortment of gadgets that looked straight out of a sci-fi movie. One corner of the room housed what appeared to be a containment unit with a bright yellow sign reading caution, "Do not feed." Greg made a mental note to ask about that later, or never. "So, what's first on the agenda?" Greg asked, trying to sound professional while casually leaning against a console, and promptly missing, almost falling backward. Xena caught him with an amused smirk. "Let's start easy. You can assist me in a routine procedure, patching up Commander Zorgan's battle wound," she said, her tone light, but her eyes twinkling mischievously. "Commander Zorgan?" Greg echoed, trying to remember if Zorgan was in any of his textbooks. It sounded like the name of a Saturday morning cartoon villain. Xena gestured toward the far door just as it hissed open, and in stomped Commander Zorgan, all 7 feet of him, covered in what looked like armor made of shiny black rocks. His face was a permanent scowl, and he carried himself like someone who could break you in half just by thinking about it. "Oh, fantastic," Greg muttered under his breath. "This was supposed to be easy." Zorgan, apparently hearing him, grunted, which sounded like 2 asteroids colliding. "Is this my doctor?" His voice was so deep Greg swore it rattled the fillings in his teeth. Xena clapped Greg on the shoulder. Dr. Greg here is new, but he's brilliant. He'll have that wound patched up in no time. Won't you, Greg? Greg nodded weakly, staring at the massive gash on Zorgan's forearm. It looked like someone had taken a plasma cutter to him. Oh yeah, just a routine patch job on a battle-hardened warrior twice his size. Nothing to worry about. Grabbing some medical supplies, Greg approached Zorgan with the air of a man walking towards his doom. Okay, Commander, just hold still and, try not to crush me if this stings. Zorgan narrowed his eyes, leaning down until his face was level with Greg's. I don't feel pain, human. Greg gulped. Well, that's reassuring. Let's get started. As he carefully applied the futuristic equivalent of stitches, Zorgan barely flinched. Xena leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching with an amused grin. Greg finished the procedure in record time, stepping back with a relieved sigh. There you go, all patched up. Just, take it easy for a few days. No. Plasma sword fights. Zorgan stood up, inspecting his arm. Humph. You've done well, Doctor. Then, after a long pause, he added, for a squishy. Greg blinked. Thanks. Zorgan stomped out of the med bay without another word, leaving Greg standing there, heart pounding. He turned to Xena, who was laughing silently to herself. For a squishy, huh? Xena said, wiping a tear from her eye. You're gonna fit right in here, Greg. Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. If I survive the week, that is. Don't worry, Xena said with a wink. The week's just getting started. We've still got a shapeshifter schedule for later. And trust me, those appointments never go according to plan. Greg stared at her, wide-eyed, wondering exactly what kind of cosmic chaos he'd signed up for. This was going to be one wild ride. Greg had barely caught his breath after patching up Commander Zorgan when Xena strolled up to him, a wicked smile playing on her lips. So, you ready for your next patient? She asked, twirling a stylus between her fingers like a baton-wielding ringmaster about to unleash the next act of the circus. Greg's eyes widened. Already? We just finished with Zorgan. Shouldn't I don't know, debrief? Meditate? Maybe take a snack break? Xena shook her head, still grinning. No time for snacks in space, Dr. Greg. This station never sleeps, and neither do the shapeshifters. Wait, shapeshifters? Greg's heart immediately jumped into warp speed. Oh yeah, Xena said with a twinkle in her eye. Gorflax is on the schedule for a routine checkup. You'll love him. He's friendly most of the time. Before Greg could protest, the door to the med bay slid open, and in floated, well, it was hard to describe exactly what floated in. It was an amorphous blob of shimmering color, constantly shifting between neon pink, electric blue, and a shade of green Greg was fairly certain didn't exist in nature. The blob rippled as it hovered, and Greg could have sworn it gave him a wink. Or maybe it was a blink. It was hard to tell with blobs. Dr. Greg, meet Gorflax, Xena said, gesturing grandly to the shifting mass of goo. Gorflax, this is Dr. Greg. He's new, so go easy on him. The blob bubbled in response, making a sound that was somewhere between a gurgle and a burp. A second later, Gorflax morphed into a roughly humanoid shape, complete with arms, legs, and a face that seemed to be a mashup of various celebrities Greg vaguely recognized but couldn't quite place. It was like looking at a wax sculpture made by someone who'd only been given verbal descriptions. Dr. Greg, so nice to meet you. Gorflax's voice was cheerful, but slightly echoed, as if it was coming from the bottom of a well. I've heard you're a real whiz at fixing up carbon-based life forms. Greg forced a smile, feeling every muscle in his body tense up. Thanks? Just doing my best out here. Good, Gorflax said, his face morphing mid-sentence, one of the eyes suddenly becoming enormous while the other shrank. So, how about we get this checkup over with? I've got a poker game with a couple of space whales later, and they hate it when I'm late. Something about the tides. Greg nodded slowly, trying not to stare too hard at the ever-changing face. Right, a routine checkup. Let's start with, your vitals. He reached for his medical scanner but hesitated. Do you have vitals? Sure do. Gorflax's body rippled and shifted, and suddenly, he sprouted what appeared to be a very human-looking chest, complete with a perfectly chiseled six-pack. Go ahead, Doc. Scan away. Greg glanced at Xena, who gave him an encouraging nod, clearly enjoying his discomfort far too much. With a sigh, Greg waved the scanner over Gorflax's chest. The machine beeped in confusion. Greg muttered, glancing at the readout, which was currently flashing random numbers and symbols that looked more like a cryptic crossword puzzle than medical data. This doesn't seem right. Oh, don't worry about that, Gorflax said casually, his arm transforming into a tentacle and patting Greg on the shoulder. My vitals don't play by the rules. Just write down healthy, and you'll be fine. That's what the last guy did. Greg blinked. The last guy? Xena chimed in, trying to suppress a grin. Oh yeah, the last doctor here had a bit of a meltdown after Gorflax's checkup. Took a long vacation. Somewhere far away. Alone. Greg gulped. Fantastic. Still, he tried to keep his cool. Okay, let's move on. Do you have any symptoms I should know about? Weird aches? Discomfort? Sudden urge to turn into a giant squid? Gorflax laughed, his laugh sounding like bubbles popping underwater. No, nothing like that. Although, I did wake up this morning with a slight case of molting. Molting? Greg repeated, not sure if he wanted to know more. Yeah, shit in my outer layer. Happens every few months. It's like a deep space spa treatment. I feel refreshed afterward. But sometimes I leave bits of myself behind, and people think I'm an alien crime scene. Very awkward. Greg's jaw dropped. Bits of yourself? Oh, don't worry. Gorflax waved a gooey hand dismissively. It's totally natural. I just try to avoid public transport on those days. Xena, clearly enjoying this way too much, tapped a finger to her chin. Greg, maybe you should check for any signs of excess molting? We don't want a repeat of the time he left half of himself, in the station's cafeteria. Greg stared at Gorflax, who was now smiling with a set of bright purple teeth, and slowly raised the scanner again. All right, let's see if there's anything, left behind. As he scanned, Gorflax's body began to shimmer and ripple again, the colors shifting wildly. I'm sure I'm all in one piece, Doc. But if you find a spare finger or two, just toss it in the bin. It'll grow back. Greg let out a nervous laugh, hoping Gorflax was joking, but there was no way to tell with a shapeshifter. After what felt like the longest 3 minutes of his life, the scanner beeped, and Greg sighed with relief. Well, everything seems as normal as it can be for a shapeshifter. You're good to go, Gorflax. Fantastic, Gorflax exclaimed, his body once again morphing, this time into the spitting image of Greg. Look at that. I'm Dr. Greg, ready to save lives and make awkward small talk with aliens. Greg blinked, staring at the exact replica of himself standing in front of him. Can you not? All right, sorry. Gorflax shifted back into his colorful blob form, giving a sheepish smile. Couldn't resist. Xena clapped her hands together. Well, that went better than expected. No molten Gorflax puddles on the floor this time. I'd call that a win. Greg, feeling a bit lightheaded, nodded. Yeah, win. Sure. As Gorflax floated out of the med bay, humming some alien tune, Greg slumped against the console, exhausted. Xena patted him on the back. You did great, Greg. You're practically a veteran now. Who knows? Maybe next time Gorflax will invite you to the poker game. Greg looked up, eyes wide. Do space whales even have cards? Xena shrugged with a grin. Guess you'll find out. Greg sighed. This is going to be a long tour, isn't it? Xena laughed. Oh, you have no idea. Greg awoke to the unsettling sensation of something cold and squishy wrapped around his leg. His first thought was that he'd fallen asleep in the med bay and one of Gorflax's spare limbs had somehow found its way to his bunk. But as his eyes blinked open, he found himself staring at, well, an octopus. A very large, very purple octopus, complete with glowing, bioluminescent spots. Its tentacles were lazily draped over the edge of his bed, one of them curling around his foot like a weird alien foot warmer. Good morning, Dr. Greg, the octopus said cheerfully, its voice resonating in his head rather than coming out of a mouth, because, of course, it didn't have one. I trust you slept well? Greg shot upright, heart pounding. Why is there a talking octopus in my room? The octopus blinked its enormous, liquid black eyes at him. "I'm not an octopus, dear doctor. My name is Lorlax. I'm the station's xenobiologist. I also happen to resemble an Earth octopus in this form, which I find quite convenient for multitasking." As if to prove the point, Lorlax used one tentacle to straighten Greg's bedsheet and another to hand him a cup of something that suspiciously smelled like coffee. Greg stared at the cup, bewildered. Did you just make me coffee?" "Oh yes. It's not easy finding Earth beverages this far from your home planet, but I've replicated it to the best of my ability. Tastes mostly like coffee, I think." Greg hesitantly took a sip. "Mostly?" Lorlax's tentacles waved dismissively. "There may be a hint of squid ink in there, purely for flavor." Greg gagged, nearly spilling the cup. "You put squid ink in my coffee?" "Only a dash," Lorlax said brightly, his tentacles wriggling in what Greg assumed was excitement. "It adds a robust, slightly salty undertone. Quite popular on Gorloth 7, I assure you." Greg set the cup down, making a mental note to never let anything remotely resembling a squid prepare his food ever again. He rubbed his face, still trying to process the fact that an xenobiologist was casually chilling in his room, chatting about coffee like this was completely normal. "Okay, Lorlax, not that I don't appreciate the hospitality, but why are you here? In my room? At 6:30 in the morning?" Lorlax blinked, looking perplexed. "All right. You've been summoned to breakfast with the station's captain. It's a tradition for new staff to meet Captain Crag, and he's eager to size you up. Figuratively, of course." Greg's stomach flipped. "Captain Crag? Why does that name sound like I should be terrified?" Lorlax's tentacles gave a slight twitch. "Oh, no reason. Just, he's known for his unique breakfast choices and for testing the mettle of newcomers. Nothing too extreme." Greg sighed and flopped back onto the bed. "I'm not sure I'm ready for unique breakfast choices. I just dealt with a shape-shifting blob and a battle-hardened warrior with a vendetta against plasma burns. I'm not sure I have any metal left to test." Lorlax patted him comfortingly with a tentacle. "Don't worry, doctor. I'm sure you'll do fine, but I wouldn't eat too much beforehand. Just a suggestion." That did not make Greg feel better. A short while later, Greg found himself in the station's mess hall, sitting at a long metal table across from Captain Crag, who was, unsurprisingly, exactly as intimidating as his name suggested. The captain was a mountain of a man with a square jaw that looked like it could have been used to carve statues and biceps the size of small moons. His uniform was impeccably clean except for a suspicious stain near the collar that Greg was certain had to be blood. Or ketchup. He wasn't sure which he'd prefer. "So," Captain Crag said in a voice that sounded like gravel being poured down a garbage disposal, "you're the new doc." Greg nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Dr. Greg at your service." Crag eyed him with a gaze that could probably melt steel. "Hope you've got thick skin, document. This station's no place for the faint of heart." "Take thick skin, right?" Greg stammered. "I'm working on it." Crag grunted, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see. Now, before we talk business, we eat." He slammed a massive hand on the table, and as if on cue, a tray was slid in front of Greg by a passing crew member. On it was the most questionable collection of food he had ever seen. There was something that looked like neon blue scrambled eggs, a stack of triangular green pancakes, and what Greg could only describe as a wriggling pile of pink noodles that seemed to be moving. He wasn't sure whether to eat it or call the med bay. "Is this breakfast?" Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper that could only be described as predatory. "Ah, that's the good stuff. We got Grixian eggs, which taste like cinnamon if you can get past the fact they glow in the dark. Those green things? Bagroot pancakes. Don't let the name fool you. They're actually delicious if you don't think about the fact they grow in swamps. And this," he pointed at the wriggling pile, "is a delicacy. Squirmy noodle fins. Don't mind the moving. They stop after you chew for a while." Greg blinked, torn between the urge to flee and the fact that Crag was watching him like a hawk waiting to see if his prey would break. "Dig in," Crag said, scooping up a heaping pile of the noodle fins and shoveling it into his mouth like it was candy. He chewed slowly, the wriggling gradually slowing, which, if possible, made Greg feel even more queasy. With all the courage of a man about to face his own demise, Greg picked up his fork and prodded the Grixian eggs first. They jiggled ominously. Hesitating, he took a small bite, and to his surprise, a burst of cinnamon flooded his mouth. Not bad. He glanced up at Crag, who was watching him expectantly. Pretty good, Greg said, trying not to sound too relieved. Crag grunted approvingly. Not bad for your first try. Now try the noodle fins. Greg stared at the writhing pink mass, his stomach doing somersaults. Slowly, he stabbed a forkful and raised it to his mouth, mentally preparing for the worst. The moment the noodle fins touched his tongue, they wriggled harder, like they were trying to escape. He clamped his mouth shut and chewed, feeling like he was in some kind of twisted space reality show. After what felt like an eternity, the squirming finally stopped, and Greg swallowed hard. He looked at Crag, forcing a smile. See? Not so bad. Crag's face remained stone cold for a moment before he let out a booming laugh that echoed through the mess hall. You've got guts, document. I like that. Greg exhaled in relief, grateful to still be in one piece. Crag slapped him on the back hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. You'll do just fine here, kid. Just remember, this station might be wild, but we're a family. A weird, dysfunctional family that occasionally eats squirmy things for breakfast, but a family nonetheless. Greg, now gasping for air, nodded. I'll keep that in mind. As Captain Crag dug into his second plate of alien food, Greg slumped back in his chair, wondering once again what on earth, no, what in the galaxy, he'd gotten himself into. And to think it was only breakfast.